for joining us. My name is Enrique Mendizabal. I'm the director on think tanks, and I'm going to be moderating this session on think tanks and the media. We have with us Stuart from Chatham House, Maurice Otieno from Baraza Media Lab in Kenya, Holly Shulman from the Center for Global Development in the US, and Hans Gutbrod. And Hans, actually, I don't really know where you are now. Are you in Tbilisi or in somewhere else
Yes,
in the world?
I'm in Tbilisi at the moment.
Okay.
You might hear children playing outside from time to time.
That's right. That's lovely sound. Unless they're in your room and you can't get any work done. But thank you, Ryan. So we've already started a little bit of conversation about the issue of the loaded word partnerships and how the media might interact in a relationship with organizations and position them in different spaces. As with every session, we want to know about why is the relationship between think tanks and the media important? Why should they collaborate, cooperate, and possibly partner? How can they do it? What might be good practices and good ways to get this done, and also what do think tanks need to do differently? How they need to prepare themselves to be able to take full advantage of these opportunities. And I want to start with Holly first. And Holly, you are working at CGD, a think tank focusing on international development, based in the US, but I think you have an office in the UK as well, looking at Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about your strategy in working with the media? What might be some of the new ways in which you've been engaging with the media? And then I'm going to go to Stuart, and then I'm going to go to the media and ask Maurice to comment and to reflect from his point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we are an independent think tank, and we don't have institutional positions. So that's one thing that might separate us from other people. We don't have an agenda for global development or an agenda for foreign aid. Each individual researcher and their research products adds data and evidence to debates that are current, and proposes some solutions and has a call to action for policymakers. So kind of where we start is we look at what is the research coming out? What is the dream headline? What do they hope people know about the research? What do they hope people do about the research, and who needs to do that thing? And so that kind of defines our media strategy for each individual product. So, we might have something that says global leaders need to contribute more money to a global vaccine effort. And the person who needs to act in that situation is a decision maker at WHO. And so for that, you say, okay, what did they read? What do they do? And so, we might want an op-ed in a Geneva publication. We might, pitch global health reporters on what's in that research, to make sure it ends up in kind of these global health focused publications. But we also think about email and social media and all these things. So, it's really about these targeted strategies. Oftentimes someone will come to me and they say, oh, I have new research coming out. We want a decision maker at the IMF who works in an implementing office to do this thing. Let's get an op-ed in The Economist. And I said, why don't you email that person first? So, there's a lot of that. So making sure that strategy is matched with the goals of the research is kind of our number one thing.
And Holly, when we talked before, you were telling me that you've been trying sponsored content, which I thought was very interesting. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that, because it's an issue there of resources, right? So staff and funding, and CGD doesn't just have one media officer, right? You
Right. Yeah. So our team is set up. We actually have 4 people right now. We went from kind of 0 a few years ago to having 4 communications managers with all different titles. Some are press secretaries, some are media relations managers, but they all kind of serve in the same role of, really working on both our proactive rollout strategies around new research, but then also kind of getting our experts into the news around breaking news in their issue areas. And so, I think as part of any kind of communication strategy and rollout, we need to consider all the things so that is events, that's how we present the publication, that's a blog post, that's a media outreach strategy. And now we've been thinking a little more about kind of, is there a paid strategy? Some of that is in social media ads, because we can do very targeted things, right? Audiences that look like the people who follow the Gates Foundation, for example, right? So we can really do very targeted, in-depth things to get the right people to see the right products that might not have a general audience appeal. But also thinking about, for us, this targeted strategy kind of extends to a lot of trade publications, for example. So maybe we have new research related to a new insurance product that could help with disaster relief efforts in developing countries. And we really want the insurance commissioners in Southeast Asia to see it. So Asian Insurance Review is a natural placement. And some of these publications, offer paid partnerships as a primary way that they generate content. And so, we do look at these things too, because, the landscape is changing. There's fewer reporters, I think we all know, who cover international development as a thing, right? That's not a common beat anymore. And when it is, oftentimes they're drawn into other kind of global crises with Ukraine, with Afghanistan, with COVID. And so we try to get creative about the ways to kind of reach our targets.
Great, thank you. And you talked about that sort of that changing landscape, and I guess big change recently has been the war in Ukraine, and we've seen a lot of content around the war in Ukraine coming from think tanks. And let me go to Stuart for a second. Chatham House has shown up a lot in media. I'm living now in Barcelona, and I've seen Chatham House referenced in El País and La Vanguardia and different papers quite often, actually. Does that change relationship between Chatham House and the media? Have you had to do things differently? What lessons can you draw from this experience?
Thanks, Enrique, and I'm really glad that it's reached El País and other places that you're reading too. It's really good to hear that, encouraging. Really interesting to hear Holly's remarks. Actually, a lot of commonality actually from, I think, strangely, we discussed we had before. We found that we've learned quite a lot in the last two and a half years in the pandemic. Maybe some lessons from the work we did on that coming into, it felt like straight into the conflict in Ukraine without drawing a breath. That I hope that we've learned from that. I guess for me, the thing that's been interesting, maybe a thread that runs between the two, is that they're both just, as we all know, we're living just huge global issues, and I hesitate to use the word story because it seems demeaning, but for us as a kind of international institute, I guess much like Holly, is that the challenge has been not what to do, but what not to do. Where do you start with two issues like this that are so huge? And as you rightly point out, Holly, that these kind of stories, when they happen, just push everything else out off the front pages, off space. Really, where do you get your voice in there? And in that. Now it seems just a melee, doesn't it? So that for us has been the challenge, I guess, Enrique, has been trying to look at where is our place, what can we add to this? And in terms of, I guess, for media partnerships, you have that, or relations, you have that interesting dynamic that happens, doesn't it, during these times where we're all in demand suddenly everyone wants a piece of you and your people and your expertise to fill that space, to fill that gap of knowledge. And you have to kind of pull back a bit and say, well, particularly with the war in Ukraine, we had to kind of pull back and say, we need to be a little bit careful here because this thing is moving really fast. And I guess like the pandemic is what we learned is that, disinformation and information is incredibly complex now. Things are moving at lightning speed. It's hard to verify stuff. And we need to be really careful with our brand, that we're making sure we're not jumping in too early, and we're jumping in at the right points, and that's involved, being quite selective, I guess, in the media. We know, building on those relationships from the past, making sure that we have trust both ways. And some things we've got right, and some things we've got, not so right. I think. I guess that's my sort of overall take. Is the weirdly these two huge stories that have these massive kind of domino effects into geopolitics, health, security, cyber. It seems like there's no boundaries anymore. So that's been the challenge for us. Is where do you create those partnerships and where do you bring value?
And what do you do with those issues that Chatham House studies and has been studying for a long time, and just they're not getting any attention during these crises?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? Yeah. And then I'm really keen to know what Holly says. I mean, I think Holly, you hit the nail on the head with international development. It's just like, it's always the kind of poor child in the room, isn't it? You know, no pun intended, that it just gets forgotten. You know, when there's a huge incident, refugees, it's a case of pulling them back in, I guess, isn't it? We have to kind of look at these things and say, these are not isolated issues, you know, around migration and, health security. These things don't happen in a vacuum, but in terms of conflict or pandemic, they come to the forefront, they bubble up. And for our researchers, and I'm sure it's the same for your guys, is that sometimes their frustration comes through. They say, you know, for the people who've been Russia watchers, that we've been warning about this for years. Where were you guys before? You know, and we have to kind of say, yeah, now is your time. This is the time now. And, you know, I guess trying to find that way to segue into the media noise and that, you know, huge conversation out there to say, right, now we want to talk about COVAX, now we want to talk about access to vaccines, you know, about health security, or, you know, migration rights. These things are now. This is your time. So for me, that's where we have our job, I guess, is to kind of horizon scan and say, look, this isn't, you know, CNN want to talk about what's happening in Mariupol, but you know, we can use this to talk about you know, migration, about border insecurity, about things you've been talking about for years. To be a little bit opportunistic, I guess, in a good way.
You're sort of describing a dialogue with the media, and I don't know if this is actually what happens. So in your role, Holly and Stuart, is that what happens? That literally, you know, there's an ongoing conversation with them, you know, in events and meetings, on the phone, and advising them on what should be the ways in which they should frame issues. And to some extent, that is a partnership. That is, you know, there is an open, honest collaboration between you, if that is the case.
I think for me, like, there are definitely some key folks who we're in touch with all the time, but a lot of work goes into those conversations before we have them, right? So, you know, Stuart just mentioned an example, you know, about like kind of using these opportunities or these moments where there's like windows for policy action to kind of apply our research. And I'll talk a little bit about one of those recently, which is you may have seen that a lot of people around the world were booking Airbnbs in Ukraine to basically send money to people in Ukraine, right, to residents. So they book these Airbnbs, they cancel them, and the host would get the money. And what this in essence was a cash transfer program, which is not something that makes the news a lot, right? No one's talking about cash transfers. And so I went to the researchers who talk on those issues, and I was like, we need to do something. This is happening. They had never even seen this Airbnb thing. It was like all over my Facebook, and everywhere I looked, I'm like, you know, kind of a travel fanatic. So they're like, oh, well, we don't, you know, they're like, okay, well, we do have some thoughts on kind of, is this right? How will this work? Is this the best way to use this money? Is this the best way to get aid to people? And I was like, great, let's write a blog post. So, you know, they wrote up the post, we sent it out. And then I was able to approach a lot of reporters, both with whom I've had relationships before, who kind of work on more newsy aspects of global development, but then also people who work on write about hotels, like Hospitality Net went crazy for this, and Vox wrote a big piece about it. But, you know, it's like seeing what's in the news, and then we have to do all the legwork to make sure we have the research, data, and evidence, because that's what our jobs are focused on. And then we can go back to reporters and be like, this is what we have. Are you interested? So I don't know, Stuart, I don't want to speak for you, but a lot goes into those conversations before they happen.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's a great example, Holly. It's really interesting to hear that, isn't it? Yeah, and it's a lovely moment. You think, when you've got something in your back pocket and you think, I've got something I can add to this. Yeah, it's very similar, I think. And I think a lot of it is, like I said before, it's like a lot, for us, it is those relationships sometimes built over years, isn't it? It's about trust, you know, and there aren't, you know, you're lucky if you get those, because there's so much movement, isn't there, in media. You know, some people I've been lucky to know for years, and it does take a long time to build that trust up, to trust, you know, not only you, but the organization. And we've had similar things like that, you know, come up when then you can maybe, it's a bit of a negotiation, I guess, Enrique, isn't it? You can sort of say, yeah, I know you want to talk about, you know, May 9th and what Putin's thinking, but can we also talk about, you know, Belarus and what's happened there? You know, it's very similar. We've got some data about, you know, people polled in Belarus and what they're thinking about, you know, the conflict, and that's quite unique. Can we bring that in the mix? And if they say yes, you're great, and you can sort of steer that conversation a little bit. But I guess you have to play the game a bit, don't you, Colin? You have to kind of give them what they wanted and then choose those moments to kind of say, can we also talk about this? Because this is interesting, and hope they get excited as you do about it. Yeah.
You've mentioned trust, and I guess you were referring to trust between you and the media. But to some extent, there's also trust between you and your researchers, the researchers in the organization, that got to trust you in the way that you're going to pitch the story, or the angle, the outlets, the way you're going to connect it to another debate. What does that mean in terms of your work, your day-to-day engagement with your internal audience?
Holly, do you want to jump in, or Maurice?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's so funny because I was interviewing someone today for a position. If you're applying for jobs, we have a few open on our comms team. You should think about applying. But and he asked, like, what is the balance between reporter outreach and working with our researchers? And I would say, honestly, it's 50-50. And sometimes the researchers take up more time than the actual external outreach and working with reporters. And, that's just, it's hard because, they are very focused on what their paper says. But, we tell them that that's just, when the paper is published, that's the beginning of the process for us. That's not the end. And for them, it often feels like, or they hope that it's the end, right? They've been working on this thing for 2 years. They finally get it up. And then they're like, okay, I'm done. And I'm like, wait, but we need to talk about what the dream headlines are. What the call to action is, who you want to take action on this, who your target audience is, all these things. And then that process starts, right? So the paper is finished. We might think about, what is the embargo plan, right? I might need 5 more days to pitch reporters before it goes up. We might want to plan an event. We might want to do all these things. And so I think it's hard, because their job is finished and ours is just starting, but we need them to help us do our jobs at that point. So.
Okay. Thank you. Let me go to Maurice now, to the other side of this partnership. Maurice, you work with the media. You work trying to strengthen the media. Can you very briefly tell us about the work you do in Kenya and in Africa, and then maybe reflect on that side of the partnership and how media organizations, and maybe particularly new media, right? New generations of journalists and media outlets are and can work with researchers and think tanks.
Thanks so much, Enrique. As the conversation was going on, I was just picking up a lot of similarities of what media is going through, similar to what the think tanks are going through. I'll start by saying, first of all, so Baraza Media Lab. So Baraza, as a name, is a word that means a meeting, is a Swahili word that means a meeting spot for the community to discuss some of their issues. So it's very apt to what we are trying to do at Baraza, where it's basically a space where we bring the media and we say to look at what is ailing media, what is making media in Kenya or even on the continent not to function as it should be. And this was actually, this stemmed out of a research that was commissioned by Media Networks that then led to the launching of Baraza Media Lab. And the idea for us was to have this physical space as a convening spot for media, researchers, governments, civil society, to come in and start having those very honest conversations about how do we hold power to account, one, but how does the media facilitate that? So those are some of the conversations that we have within the physical space, but we do that through the programs that we run, the events that we run, the research that we do conduct, and sometimes also some collective problem solving that we do hold the community to do. So in essence, what we do is almost like cross-cutting to what the think tanks are doing in terms of providing the knowledge and the research point of view, and connecting it to policy, while also working with the community to be able to bring some of those solutions to fore. So that's what Baraza Media Lab does. So it's a experimentation space for a lot of these ideas where the community is coming together to problem solve, especially within the media. And I'd like to circle back and highlight some of the issues that the research that led to our launching brought, and you'll see some similarities. One of the things that they notice that globally, and even including Kenya, there's a significant diminishing rate of revenues for media. And this could be due to the prevalence of social media, which is taking away the advertising budgets. Hence, this makes media to be on a hamster wheel where you're always running to get the money, and that makes you not to focus on what you need to focus on as media, because now you focus more on the bottom line. Then there is less and less interesting storytelling models that they noticed that are keeping the audience not engaged. If you have platforms like TikTok and you have platforms like WhatsApp, breaking news, then you don't want to look at TV. Or you have Twitter. You don't want to look at TV, which is boring, a boring guy in a suit and talking serious stuff. You want to see the quick communication that is being churned out social media. Then lastly, there's a lot of political interference, especially with media in Kenya. So our main six media houses in Kenya are owned by politicians or people closely tied to political families. And that you can see how that can skew how information is shared. Like right now, we are going into an election in 3 months, 96 days. And you can already see how these media houses are aligned to various political parties. So the solution was to have this physical space that enables independent media to thrive and to better test so that they can come up with sustainable solutions, but also to test interesting storytelling models that will capture the audience. And mainly also to look at their sustainability as independent media, so that they're not so dependent on advertising, which was the initial challenge that or is still the challenge that mainstream media in Kenya is focused on. You find in 2013, after our 2013 elections, the government was the largest advertiser on all media houses, almost holding about, I will easily say almost 80% of, but I need to confirm that, but almost 80% of their revenues. And when 2013 happened and the media was really heavy on bashing the current president and the vice in terms of their cases that they had in the ICC, the first thing that they did was to take away the advertising on media and moved it onto their digital platform. And in a sense, that quickly made them quiet, right? Because you've taken all their revenue. So now they are scrambling, they are cutting down on their staffers, and they're basically paper chasing. And this is really, to your point, Stuart, what you're talking about, like reduced or had friction in terms of trust, really reduce the trust element between media and the public. There's a research that was done recently, and I can try and look for it, to just show how Kenyans trust social media more than mainstream media, which is a sad state of affair to have.
And Maurice, what you're describing, I mean, it's very similar to my own country in Peru. That dialogue that Stuart and Holly you've been talking about that goes on with the media, you expect there's somebody on the side of the newspapers and the TV station, the radio stations, the magazines that you can dialogue with, that has the capacity to engage with some of the research you are producing. And I think that's similar to the conversation we had before on political parties. But when the media is cutting down on jobs, there are no editors specialized on any issue, health, education. It's just journalists that cover whatever story comes their way. That dialogue is very hard and it's very difficult to happen just spontaneously. So, I mean, Maurice, are there any initiatives that you can talk about where maybe independent media or mainstream media has overcome this challenge? Have built in expertise, developed partnerships with some think tanks or NGOs to make up for that expert capacity or editorial capacity?
Yes, yes, there are some cases and examples that I can share. So, for example, you find there's a couple of publications that are almost like, there's one called The Elephant in Kenya. The Elephant does a very good job in terms of just these very long reads that are more in-depth and well-researched. And you find like mainstream media who are struggling to have people with that capability or skills partner with a small independent media to seed some of their content. That is well-researched, and it's a publication that they have done. Same to what Holly was mentioning initially, where you do this article and put it up on the media. So it's basically a small media house with little resources, but have very heavy research capabilities, partnering with a big legacy media who has the reach, but does not have the capabilities or capacity, and they share that. The other example that I'll think of is a project that we are currently doing in Kenya called Fumbua. That's I'll just type it on the chat so that people can see. But what that does is that we basically brought all the media houses and they are all working to combat misinformation around elections right now, similar to some initiatives that we see in some places like in Brazil and Mexico. I think there's Verificado and Comprova. And it's basically to bring the mainstream media together, not mainstream actually, media houses, independent mainstream, social media influencers also are very critical and upcoming point of information also that you cannot avoid. And we bring them together to basically say, hey, how can we combat misinformation? Because we know that most of these mainstream media houses also don't have fact checkers on their desks. So how do you utilize the power of fact checkers who will go and do research and find these issues, and then we all amplify, because we know that mainstream media has reach. So those are some of the few examples that I've seen in Kenya that are currently working.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask Hans to come in. Maybe Hans, if you can say briefly just a few reflections on what you've heard, and then we're going to send everybody on smaller breakout rooms. We're going to try this function in Hopin so that you can have a bit of a conversation with your colleagues, and then we'll come back and we'll let people in to join the conversation and ask questions or add their views. Hans, any quick reflections?
Yes, very quickly. Thomas Carothers 10 years ago already, in a meeting at the time with the think tank fund, described that a journalist they were interviewing for the Carnegie Endowment, a journalist they were interviewing for the Washington Post, who was potentially going to join the Carnegie Endowment, that person said that they thought of thought of the think tank as a competitor. And Thomas Carothers said, why are we a competitor? And said, well, you're a content provider. That's what we do normally. And now people kind of disintermediate and go directly. And of course, that in a way cuts journalists' jobs as well. So I think, it's a very interesting question. At the same time, at some point, there's a risk for think tanks as well, that in the way that if you look at Ukraine, that concept has, what goes on there has become so, if you will, legible. It's very fragmented, but it's become so legible that people seem to go on there. So I think it's a very interesting question. So Holly, fascinated, of course, to hear what you were saying. One thing that I was wondering about specifically from you, more or less a landmark thing that almost everybody has always recommended, was the Ruth Levine and Lawrence MacDonald, the 12 steps to program to policy change. I'm just curious how much is that still something that's actually, where internally the faith is being kept, or is it kind of primarily the people that think that this is really the point of reference, that they're on the outside? So it's one question. Maybe if we just run very quickly through, and then the other question that I'm curious about in general, and that also goes to Stuart, how do you run this? If you then does that mean you have a weekly? And I think, here really the nuts and bolts that may be of interest to some of the people in the audience as well. Do you have a weekly, this is what's going to be in the news, kind of similar to what Tortoise Media does, the kind of an open news media, but no, actually what a news organization does. You say, these are going to be the stories, this is what we need. Or do you run it bilaterally in the organization, that you then go to people and say, listen, this is going to come up? And because I think that's interesting about the question, what kind of rhythm do organizations build? And what are the tools for that? In terms, is it Slack, or is it, how does that run? And then also the question, how do you reflect on that? And then Maurice, lastly, one question that I thought was interesting. If I think about one of the key differences about great think tank performance, and sometimes where you think, it's kind of, great stuff, but still some way to get there. I then sometimes just think also of Soapbox and Cast from Clay, and that what role those organizations, and these are just two that I'm familiar with and that have, of course, been kind of engaging with OTT in various ways, but how those mediating institutions play a huge role. And Maurice, as I understand you, I mean, that's one thing you're trying to do also, that you learn and kind of bundle these things and bundle the experience, and then try to kind of make sure that there's, in a way, not just people trying and failing to reach policymakers, but that there's a structured process. I'll leave it at that. I mean, I found this absolutely fascinating. I could go on, but I'm sure many others have questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. I'm going to let Holly, Stuart, and Maurice to respond quickly, and then we'll go into this breakout room so we get people participating as well. Holly?
Yeah, so I think we typically go by that. I think it's so ingrained in our culture now that there's not a lot of like reference to it, but looking at the steps, you know, that's kind of what we go through. I would say I'm most involved at stage 11, which is identify key decision makers and ways to reach them, and kind of with the message, which isn't really in here, but you know, I think as things have changed over the years, having that one sentence pitch, elevator pitch, matters a lot more than it did before. And I would also say we've kind of dug a little more into kind of key stakeholders and how to reach them. We've built our own audience up a lot. I think we have like 400,000 Twitter followers or something. You know, all those things have kind of grown over the years since this document was written. And so, you know, when we want to reach the development community, that's our own channels, to your point about we're content producers. But I think when we want to reach kind of top policymakers, key decision makers, that, you know, thinking outside of our own channels is still very important. And I would say we've kind of dug in on that number 11 a bit and kind of have separated that out and figured out new ways to reach targets and to really get in front of them multiple times and have them engage with our work. So
great, thank you. And Stuart, do you guys have these sort of meetings every week and decide what's on the front page and what stories pitched?
Yeah, I wish we could decide what's on the front page. we don't wield that power. But yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it, Hans? Yeah, we do. I think almost in the moment we've had daily huddles until obviously on Ukraine. So we kind of mimic. I mean, I'm from a news background. We mimic that kind of newsroom rhythm. But I mean, to Maurice's point, which I think he threw up some big questions there. I mean, it's a kind of post-Trumpian stuff, isn't it? Isn't it fascinating where we, you know, mainstream media has become a really dirty word. You know, it's like that seems a really negative thing. And I think for me, what's jumping out from maybe all of you guys is that, I guess, is this sort of idea of the payoff, isn't it? You know, there's we're all looking at our own audiences, similar to Holly, that we're looking at the mainstream, the legacy media. We recognise the power and the reach of that, and the fact that our researchers want to be there, the clout that has with policymakers and decision makers. But equally, we've got all got these things going in tandem. You know, we're getting pulled into paid media and those kind of channels. And I think it's a symbiotic thing. You know, they both need each other, because if we turn our backs on media and we join that exodus of people, as Maurice was saying, you know, just that don't want to get into the long reads and stuff, into the detail, we're part of the problem. I think, you know, we have to support, we have to criticize, we have to be criticized. I think it's really important. It's very easy, isn't it, to have a nice written piece, 900 words, stick it on our website, we get 20,000 reads, maybe a few 100,000 over the year, but no one, you know, you're not, is the scrutiny there? Did you get the angry letters into the New York Times, or people attacking you on Twitter? Not that we want to be attacked, but, you know, so I think it's very easy to think one is good and one is bad, but I think actually now we're at the place where they both feed each other. You know, we share content that's republished by papers where they let us behind paywalls, and vice versa. They see things that we have on our own channels, and that leads to other opportunities. So I'd like to think there's a really symbiotic thing, and we shouldn't be sniffy about either one. I think they've both got their place. I think Maurice sounds like some fascinating work there, which is really important. You know, the fact that we have to invest, not just financially, but kind of, you know, sort of morally in media of all kinds, and be open about it is a really, really important point. And the work you're doing sounds great.
Great. So Maurice, maybe a reflection, and then we can go into discussions.
Yeah, I would like to say about things media needing to work together.
Sorry, Maurice, I think I'm Is it just me, or is the audio?
Can you guys hear me?
I think better now.
Okay, cool. I think it's my headphone which is misbehaving. I'll hold it this way so I look cool. Great. Like that. But what I wanted to say is that I think to just double down on what Holly and Stuart have said, like, I think there's not only a need, but it's necessary for think tanks and media to work together from the onset. Because again, we both work in a sense that we want to share facts and information that is credible, but also we want to share it widely, basically, and using different strategies in terms of using social media platforms, using your newsletters, your media contact.
We just got interrupted a little bit, but it was great. But I think one of the questions that a lot of folks have is like, how do you convince your researchers that media matters, and to like get them working a little differently in terms of deadlines, right? And I think that's probably a challenge that all of us have. But we really try, I think we have a large number of researchers, we have backups to people, maybe there's 5 people who work on an issue, and we kind of go down the list until someone says yes, but we also try to get their buy-in. Generally, every few months we do a survey asking who's interested in doing media, what kind of training they have, and reinforcing in that we need to hear from you within an hour of a request or 2 hours of a request in your time zone, and just kind of like, because not everyone wants to do it, or not everyone can be available that way, and so it continues to be a struggle. I don't really have a good solution, but.
And Stuart?
Yeah, we had a very interesting, very short debate. We got into the kind of the evaluation and the value of the question, the kind of thinking about it first. With limited resources, is it worth you doing a massive media outreach? Because as we're all saying, it's increasingly hard. And we were citing Holly's example with just email that policymaker you want to reach, which we all thought was just genius. Because sometimes do we overthink it, with the channels. So I thought that was really interesting. And then we talked about how you prove that impact. Or I think Rebecca, your phrase was uptake. Proving that cut through, which is that sort of the golden egg, isn't it? All trying to find that someone read a piece in the Nation, Maurice, or the New York Times, and then it changed that dial on the policy front. The thing we're all looking for. So really interesting point about resources, really, and where to use wisely.
Hans? Yep.
Second, is it working? Actually, in this particular room, nobody turned up. So sometimes the breakout rooms don't work.
Yeah, that's true. Let me pose a question about the partnership. And when we started the conversation, I said, I think the partnership word is a bit loaded. Maybe it's more about collaboration. And as I've been thinking about partnership, the word and what it means, it feels that it's a bit exclusive, right? It's just you and me. And in the previous session, we talked about political parties, and I think one of the things that was raised is that you can work with political parties in plural. If you're an independent think tank, a non-partisan think tank, then that's kind of what you want to do. You want to avoid working with just one, engaging with just one. But if you have a partnership, that sort of suggests that it's just with them, and you do see a little bit of that. You do see media having a standing partnership with a think tank at different levels. So I see that in Peru. I've seen that in the UK. I see that globally. And while it's good for the think tank because it gets their idea out there, to some extent it might feel that the media is sort of not looking any further, right? So they've got that relationship, they rely on that. Maurice saying they don't have the resources to produce the content, so they rely on that organization, but they're not necessarily assessing them. They're not necessarily challenging them. They're just taking their word for granted. And as I think Veronica was pointing out in the chat, that is a risk, right? Because it's you one day, but it could be somebody else the other day. So I don't know if you have a reflection on that, and Maurice is about to join. But yeah, I don't know. Stuart or Holly, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, actually. And I think personally, it's interesting here in the UK. I'm sure it's very similar elsewhere, but UK government, of which we work, closely with, and opposition parties as well, have their favourites. And there's a kind of practice here where you're announcing something, a speech, on Thursday, but then Wednesday, mysteriously, it's trailed, leaked to favoured media, and that seems to be the way on both sides. We really stay away from doing that where we can. If we can be open, transparent, and for everyone, that's the way forward. Simply, often because it's just really simple, and that's probably and it's an odd practice, isn't it? The exclusive. As a former journalist, I know I loved getting those things. You felt special and favoured. But as you were saying, Enrique, we've seen this happen, haven't we, with governments? You're in the room, and then you're out of the room. There's change. You're out in the court. Is that democratic? Is that part of a free press? Is that just the kind of cut and thrust? I don't like to play those games personally, so I think we shouldn't get into that. But that said, we all know that, have we got an X piece of research? We know it's going to play well at international development hub. You've got your go-tos. You think you've got your friendly contacts. You think they're probably going to run it. X, Y, and Z aren't going to look at it. So it's I could be snobby about it, but I think it's the reality of the media landscape, and has been for a long time. Maurice probably knows more. Yeah.
Sorry, I've really struggled to get on this because I was like, I didn't want to let you guys down.
No, don't worry.
I hope you can hear me now.
We can hear you now. I don't know if you want to respond to this question about the partnership and whether having partnerships between think tanks and media sounds a little bit too exclusive, and really what the media should be doing is sort of just shopping around, is trying to get information from every think tank and every research organization you can get its hands on in a way. Of course, that requires capacity on the side of the media, but it would be more conducive of a debate and sort of checks and balances.
I'm of the opinion that it should be a little bit of both, where they could balance it by finding information from various think tanks and also various platforms. But at the same time, I do feel like there should be a very special relationship between the think tank and media, because in essence, I think in principle, we do both work for the same thing. Before I got cut off, I was talking about we do both work for facts and credible information. We do both work for massive consumption of the content that we produce and for effecting change, and sometimes even mostly holding power to account. So both of us are almost aligned in all the things that we are doing. And what good does it do to have a very well thought out research that collects dust on the shelves, rather being utilized for people to consume and make decisions? So I think there should be a very special relationship between media and think tanks, and as well as media can go out and use other alternative sources of finding facts or research, or having multiple think tanks as their content providers. I do think they could also have a bias towards one who produces content in a way that aligns maybe with these media houses. Because you do also know that most of these media houses right now all have their own agendas.
Right. There was a question in the chat about this very, very practical kind of question, I think, but also addressed the issue of capacity, right? So, and it was about how far should media team members develop substantive expertise? And I think this is an ongoing discussion in many think tanks when they start to bring in communicators into the teams. One of the things that researchers will say is, well, they don't understand my research, right? And they expect them to just deal with the formatting and laying out and design. Or they complain that they don't understand it, and so they say, well, but maybe we should hire young researchers and have them do the communications work. And I think that's a constant debate. I don't know if you can say something about that, Holly. A CGD, is there, what is the profile of your communications team? Is it comms people through and through?
Yeah.
Researchers who do a bit of comms, somewhere in the middle?
So we've actually gone through a little bit of a restructure on the comms team over the last few years. It used to be that we had people who were purely functional experts, right? We had someone whose job was to format the paper. We had someone whose job was to do multimedia. and to put the thing on the web and to do social media. Over the last few years, we've actually added these 4 positions that are kind of press positions, and each of them is paired with program areas that we work on. So global health, sustainable development finance, migration, education. And so each of them has one program and a few other issue areas that they also work on. And so that they're in those team meetings all the time, that they're constantly working with the researchers, and they're kind of, becoming I would say not subject matter experts, because even with those programs, we cover 100 different things and people just work on whatever they want. So, so there are new issues all the time, but at least they're kind of like have a partnership with the policy teams that's ongoing, which I think has really helped to kind of address some of the issues that that people have in this division.
Is that the same case in Chatham House, Stuart? How's the media team organized in relation to researchers?
Yeah, I think it's similar, I guess. I mean, I'm lucky that, I work with people who, particularly my current team, who've come from a background in, international relations. So that we're laughing about this morning, there's a lot of people who are really steeped in this stuff. Increasingly over the last few years, I used to have a bit of a sort of bias. I tend to lean towards ex-journalists to kind of work on press teams, but I've completely flipped on that now, although that can be good. I mean, I had a great run lately with people who've worked ex-government, not just UK, but who've worked on comms and ex-government. And I think it's a nice, because I see this as a bridge, really. People have the skill sets where they can translate, as Holly says, between, research, can speak research, but also can get comms. That's, for me, that's the kind of beautiful, the nexus, isn't it? That, and I think that's our role, isn't it? I think that's a great question from Anwar, isn't it, in the chat, that he mentioned about how far from the other side, how much does media come, how much expertise do you need? And I guess that the sort of death of the specialist correspondent, is that overplayed? It's a really good question, isn't it? Again, I'm always in the middle. I think there's truth on both sides. I think it's a case of trying to find that lovely sweet spot in the middle, isn't it, where we can, you can both can understand each other. But even though I think now there's definitely at Chatham House, there's a wide understanding of what the media is and what the media wants and how it works. We still get those moments where you ask for send me 3 bullet points and you get 8 pages, because that's the way as human beings researchers are different to hacks like me. We think of things in very pithy bullet points and headlines. They think of things in great depth, and you must have all this. And part of me loves that. They still do that. It drives us crazy, but that's why we're different, isn't it?
Can I just ask something?
Yes, go ahead. And I was going to ask you, put you in the spot, Hans, but go ahead, and then I'll get to you.
Yeah. So how do you, since it's so an interesting kind of group here together, but how do you have to demonstrate success on the inside? Yes, there's a New York Times op-ed, but, and Holly, I'm a little bit curious how that works in your case. If you have kind of 4, if you will, laterally arranged people that have their own partnerships, so to speak, how does that, is there a kind of central spreadsheet, or do you just say, well, just go for it, do stuff? And again, as the 12th step thing says, kind of just angle for the impact. Don't have a huge theory there of outputs. I'm just curious again, because I think some think tankers on here that look at this and this question of how do you measure all of this in the feedback process. And again, it's about partnerships, but of having the impact through that towards change.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. We, have this conversation all the time about how we measure impact and what is impact and all this stuff. From the media side, we've been very focused on kind of tracking what we get, what publications it's related to, how many people it reaches, what countries it's in. We actually use a tool called Meltwater. We just started using. We had done this manually for like the last 10 years, and then we finally realized that was not the smartest thing to do. And so we can then kind of like draw a line from like what the policy proposal is to the policy action, and in between the way, it was featured in DevX, and then this person called us, and then it went to the New York Times, and then we talked to this person. So I think, it allows us to kind of draw that line, but, media is only like one little lever in our world of what is impact. So as far as kind of how the team coordinates, Yeah, so like we're a little different because we don't have institutional positions. So like two researchers could produce papers and find the opposite findings, and our team would promote both of those papers. That's just like a little bit about how CGD works, and I think is a little unique. That said, you know, we are, you know, the comms team, the press team is chatting all day on you know, our chat function on Teams. And, you know, we talk to each other. Our reporter reaches out. We like let everyone know, like, hey, I'm talking to Peter Goodman at 3 o'clock. Liliana's doing it, right? One of our researchers. So, you know, we do have that ongoing kind of conversation throughout the day for awareness. But, you know, each person has individual things they're working on, research they're pitching, experts that they're responsible for. So that's kind of how we divide it up. So. And the other idea behind this theory is that, you know, if someone's working on global health all the time, then they also have relationships with global health reporters that they're building over time too. So it's not just with the team internally, but also with the external folks, which I think has proven quite helpful over the years.
Super interesting. Yeah.
So let me use you, Hans, as one of the sort of speakers, rather than just the discussant. And one of the things that's come up is the issue of trust. And Veronica asked this question about journalists being a bit worried about working with think tanks or establishing a partnership because they, you know, say, well, who's assessing them? And she mentioned transparency, and I think this has come up as well. You've worked in transparency of think tanks. You know, are there ways in which think tanks, you know, besides being transparent about the sources of funding, are there ways in which think tanks can portray themselves as reliable sources of evidence and advice to the media, in a way that even if they were in a partnership, they would not lose that independence, or they would be seen by the public as independent?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super interesting question, and I mean, in the end, I mean, you know, what's the saying that I mean, you gain trust in the spoonful and you lose it in buckets. Yeah. So I think, I mean, the challenge is more, at least as I sometimes see it, and I've recently again talked to institutions, the challenge is more how do you deal with things going disastrously wrong? And Raymond Strike has written about that. I mean, when you then kind of get caught out and your crisis management doesn't work. Because the actual increase in trust, I think that people need to see that very much up close. And yes, being transparent about your sources of funding is a part of that, but it's necessary. It's not sufficient. So I mean, I do think that there's a real difference there between, you could almost say, legacy institutions where people just know, oh, you know, like we just talked about Carnegie, or how we talk about Ruth Levine and Lawrence MacDonald as people who have long passed on to other institutions, but are still kind of associated with being foundational. And then maybe different concerns that Maurice has. When he in Kenya has maybe some very young researchers who do quite good work, but then the question is a little bit, they're relatively new. How do you prevent them from potentially making mistakes that undercut that? So I think it's situational in that way, but I'll just add one more thing. I mean, that struck me recently, how one think tank that I worked with tried to institute the trust by essentially tightening down top-down control in the institution. And I think this was doomed to fail as an approach, that you try and have everyone kind of be sitting being in the office at a certain time post-pandemic. That's not how think tanks work. But this is a fundamental challenge for the credibility of the institutions, of course, how to get the quality culture inside.
Great, thank you. And so, I don't know if anybody wants to have a last word, but coming out to the end of the session, and I think we've covered a few issues. So trust being one of them, not just with the media, which I guess it was an obvious conclusion we would arrive at in this session, but inside as well, right? Trust between the media team and the researchers and the organization. Capacities, right? Having the right teams with the right capacity to translate the knowledge that the researchers are putting together in the right formats, through the right channels, but also capacity in the media to engage with think tanks. And in some cases, you've got to build that capacity and invest in that capacity, as Maurice is doing with his team in Kenya. So it's not just going to happen, and it's actually at risk of being lost, and for different reasons, but quite similar in different parts of the world. And I think something that I take away is also the idea of dialogue, that trust is built through constant dialogue, and the same way that capacity is also built through constant dialogue. And to some extent, that's links to the previous session we had on political parties and about think tanks really understanding their that audience, or that potential partner, that potential collaborator. So understanding how the media works, what challenges it faces, what opportunities it faces, is going to help think tanks organize themselves in the most appropriate way to engage with them. I think that will be, that'll have implications, of course, on the resources, on the governance, on management, on the structure of the organizations. So I want to thank you for joining us in this session. I want to thank those who've participated, and thank you for joining the breakout rooms. And I'm sorry for those like you, Hans, who only had one, had nobody to have conversation with. I hope you had
talk to
go
myself.
for coffee. And yeah, talk to yourself. But we'll meet again just briefly, just for a recap. So whoever is online, you're welcome to join Hans and myself and anybody else for a reflection. But tomorrow, please do check the agenda. We have a full day of events that are happening throughout the world at different times of the day. And then on Thursday, again, we have sessions like this one, starting with, we'll talk about think tanks and social movements, as well as think tanks in the private sector, which I think are two other very key actors. So thank you, Hans. Thank you, Maurice, Stuart, and Holly, for joining us today. And we hope to see you again live, in person, soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you all.
Thank you very much.